longer ignore the importance of mental health. We can no longer ignore the importance of mental health workers. And we can no longer ignore the importance of the individual who is struggling to live to his fullest potential. And this brings me to a gentleman that I met 15 years ago on the sidelines of my oldest daughter's field hockey team or field, and his daughter or sister-in-law's was playing field hockey with my daughter, and I was impressed by this young man who had his toddlers. Him and his wife were on the sidelines with his toddlers at a lot of the games. I was really impressed by Mr. Yost Zee. I didn't know his story, and it's now that I learned his story. And I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Yost Zee. Bill serves as chair of the education law group at Appel, Yost, and Zee for his work in a wide range of school law, student service, and disability-related topics. Bill is a servant leader on the board of directors for a number of community benefit organizations that are important to him, including the Touchstone Foundation, formerly Lancaster Osteopathic Health Foundation, Aaron's Acres, and the Lancaster Education Foundation. William has represented public and private schools, intermediate units, and higher education institutions throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey for the past 15 years. He spearheads the education group's professional development and training initiatives with a special focus on student services, trauma-informed and restorative practices, and public school policy. Prior to entering private practice, Bill taught at the secondary level in the public schools in Philadelphia and New Jersey, and in higher education at Eastern Michigan University and Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. He also served as a dean in both admissions and academic affairs. He holds a BA from Rutgers, MS in education from the University of Pennsylvania, and JD from Villanova University. Bill is a servant leader on the board of directors for a number of community benefit organizations that I mentioned. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We can do better than that, right? I flew in from Louisville late last night, so from a national special ed institute, which was amazing. Attorneys from all around the country, but so I hope you'll show me some grace this morning. I am highly caffeinated, and I'm from New Jersey, so I tend to talk a lot with my hands and very quickly, so I'll try not to do that too much today. What I would like to talk with you about this morning is, I want to talk a little bit about and personalize this issue, particularly the intergenerational aspects of mental health and trauma in particular. I am a trauma kid. Those of you familiar with the ACEs survey and the work around adverse childhood experiences, I'm a 9. Not many people would know that, you know, the Caucasian middle-aged male in the suit who shows up to talk about things. And it was really only over the course of the last, I guess about 10 years that I have felt comfortable enough to share my own travels in mental health and my journey with respect to what I've experienced in growing up in a difficult situation and being a parent now, father and a husband. But most importantly, I think the work I've been able to do on an advocacy piece in education and you know, the impact that teachers, educators really had on, quite frankly, saving my life. So that's what I'm here to talk with you a little bit about today. We'll hit on some of the topics that I know will be covered by others with respect to legislation and supports for mental health. But I want to talk to you first just a little bit about what this looks like and the work that you're doing and how it can have an impact. Because I would not be here before you now. I would probably be in prison or dead if it wasn't for educators and those like yourselves who are willing to commit to helping young people get out of difficult situations. So this is me, 1977. That's my younger sister. You can see I have no front teeth, and the reason for that is the clothes I'm going to attribute to the 70s. Okay, I can't. But the teeth. Interesting backstory there. I was a pretty sick kid from the time I was very young because I grew up in an abusive environment. My dad was very abusive. He went into the service end up finally being dishonorably discharged for getting into trouble. He was stationed in Korea, and one night when we were bouncing around from different relatives, and my mom, my sister, and I, he called and said, I don't want to be married anymore, good luck with things. So that was sort of the way I came up. I was born in Camden, New Jersey. My mom was 17 when I was born. Coming into the world, there was a lot of conflict because her parents weren't particularly happy with the fact that their 17-year-old was pregnant. My dad was their neighbor across the street. His family had kind of a bad reputation in Gloucester City, which is where they lived at the time. And so, you know, life sort of started off in a rough patch. And the reason that's important here is there were a lot of mental health issues, a lot of drug abuse, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the mental health aspect of things really had a huge impact on my development growing up. So by 5th grade, these are all the school districts that I attended, and we're going to talk a little bit about support for schools. But I was that kid that kind of shuffled in between different schools every couple of months or every year. And those of you familiar with traumatized kids, particularly developmental trauma, we're talking about not just I was in a car accident, I was traumatized, but continuous ongoing abuse and neglect. Really has an impact on the way your brain develops. So if you think about, this is, I'm sorry, I don't have, usually I have little plastic brains I use, but I don't have it today, so you bear with me. If you think about your brain and you think about the more reptilian, they call it, part of your brain that keeps us alive, really important, right? That part of your brain, when you're traumatized, develops in a way that it sort of takes over the more rational part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, where we think a lot about our rational thought and our decision making. And so it results in that fight, flight, freeze, fawn sort of reaction to things that might not trigger other people. So my coping mechanism was I got into fights. I fought pretty much everybody in school that looked at me the wrong way. And I was not a particularly good kid in school. I was sick a lot, I missed a lot of time, we bounced around. So my academics weren't great, but I like to think I had some talent, and teachers saw that, so that'll become more important later. So just to give you a sense of what was going on, I talked about some of the intergenerational stuff. So this is the Philadelphia Inquirer from October 19th, 1984, and my family was on the front page. And you can imagine as a young person, the embarrassment and shame that was associated with that, because these weren't decisions I made as an individual, but those caretakers around me. So my dad's family, his parents in particular, there was a raid on the house in the middle of the night and morning for drug dealing. And they were all arrested, my grandfather, my grandmother, my aunt. And over the course of the next few years, there was a trial. My grandfather went to prison. My dad had already been to prison at that point, and many of his siblings as well. So there was the embarrassment piece of this, but there was also, you know, just the chaos that it threw into our family. And the reason that's important for the mental health aspect is I have PTSD. I've had it my entire life due to the abuse in our house and the environment that we grew up in. So it's been a lifelong journey, and mental health, and I'm not ashamed of that. There's no, for a long time there was a lot of shame, but when I became an advocate for students through being a teacher in higher education and ultimately a school attorney, that has really colored the lens or developed the lens through which I look at the students that I serve. And getting past that shame and stigma is a big part of what we should be talking about around mental health, because, you know, far too often, it's not so much even the diagnoses, it's seeking treatment. People don't want to engage in the system, and we'll talk a little bit about, from my perspective, what some of the flaws are in the system. And I'm going to ask, I'm very verbose, so I always want to make sure. So Megan, yell at me if my time is evaporating. I don't want to steal from others. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the statistics around mental health, and I don't want to bore you with statistics, but I think this is important because there's some key aspects of the system that I have noted in my journey, and particularly my work now professionally in working with, we represent roughly 20 school districts around the Commonwealth. I think there's some significant things with the system that we need to take a look at, and it's not just funding. Funding is a part of things, but there are several layers, as Kim mentioned, and components to this that we need to take a look at. So just some quick statistics. So 1 in 5 adults lives with mental illness, one in 5, and that number's probably low because we know, like with many things where there's stigma attached, there's a lot of underreporting. Kim mentioned suicide, but suicide is only part of the mortality issue with mental health, because mental health has an impact on your physical health. So I mentioned I'm a 9 on the ACEs scale, and there's all sorts of different ways to assess this, but if you look at some of the research there, the likelihood that I will die about 20 years sooner than I would is exponentially increased by the fact that I am above a 4 on the ACE scale. Mental health, depression, which I've dealt with, major depressive disorder at times in my life as a result of that abuse, and some of the other health-related issues, heart disease, hypertension, I go down the list. There's a dose effect with ACEs, so the higher you go, the higher your number is of those experiences before age 18, the more likely that you are going to suffer through both those mental health issues, but also physical health related issues as well. Absent your ability to lean on caring people and get the help that you need. And that's really what I want to talk about, because I like to think I'm a success story in that. I've been able to overcome a lot of the things that happen, but that isn't necessarily always true for people, and I've been very fortunate and blessed. My sister had a very different path. She didn't finish high school. She still lives in the community where a lot of those problems occurred. She's a great mom, but she did not have the opportunities I have for a whole host of reasons that I won't get into. But it's important to keep that in mind. So talk a little bit about treatment. Treatment for mental health, it works, particularly talk therapy, and talk therapy coupled with medication at times, but it needs to be effective in order to work. And those are a couple of things I want to highlight with respect to collaborative efforts, because we often silo health care in this country between mental health, physical health, substance abuse support, and that's a problem, because effective care has been shown. If you look at the UK, for instance, and the huge dip in suicides there, a lot of it has to do with the way they approach mental health and delivery of treatment. I talked a little bit already about stigma, so I won't focus too much on that. But again, it's oftentimes the negative stigma is around treatment and not so much the disorders. We're also very crass in the way we talk about mental health. It's not uncommon for people to say, oh, that person's bipolar, or that person's schizophrenic. And we need to think about, I think about it a lot in the workplace now as a leader in a law firm, that we need to kind of, if we're going to change the stigma, we need to change the way we talk about mental health. So that's really important as well. So looking again kind of at the system, now I think this is really important. So there are nearly 700,000 mental health providers in the United States. And this is a breakdown you can kind of see of where those professionals fall. And you can see there's huge disparities between the numbers with respect to, per 100,000 people who are seeking treatment, which I think is really important, and I'm going to get into why here in a second. So there are more psychiatrists than there are specialists in any other medical area. So you often hear, oh, I can't get support for mental health. And people look at the numbers and say, well, why? It doesn't make sense. And there's some really key reasons for that I'd like to illuminate a little bit. Geographic disparity in mental health. The US has a problem where it's almost as severe as the difference between the US as a developed country and some underdeveloped countries with respect to access to treatment geographically. So depending upon where you live, the neighborhood you're in, the area of the country, you may or may not be able to get treatment. And I think that's a bit of an issue here in Lancaster County. I hear it a lot in the special education work that I do, that kids in particular aren't able to get in for weeks, months at a time to see providers, and that's a problem. I talked a little bit about the disparities there. The access between rural and urban regions is a big problem. I mean, if you're in Philadelphia, there's a lot more available to you with respect to mental health than if you're in the middle part of the state or the northeastern tier of the state. there's, most mental health, and this is probably familiar to most of you in the room, is dealt with through medication, prescribing medication, which certainly has an important aspect of this, but most medications aren't prescribed by psychiatrists. Many people are working with their primary care provider with medication, and it goes back to the silo comments I made earlier that there's not good coordination there, even on the record-keeping standpoint. Access, and I've experienced this myself. My primary care provider may not know what's going on with my therapist, and I've been in therapy almost my entire life for the things that I have had to address there. But there's no coordination or communication there, and that's a problem. And I see it a lot in public school education, being a solicitor, particularly focused on special education, where there's not good lines of communication, and that's not good for kids. So that's important as well. So I want to talk about 3 major barriers, and getting kind of ahead of myself here, which I'm apt to do. So the areas I really want to focus on as we walk through some of the legislation that's out there, and I'm not going to hit every bill, but I want to highlight a few. Training. The availability of therapy workforce has not been trained in treatments that work. And that's not just me saying that. If you look into the research, we have not developed with respect to focusing on what works and how we go about training providers, be it social workers, be it therapists, as to what really works and is research-based. And I know we're going to have some conversation about that with some of the other speakers as well. Integration. The care in our country is highly fragmented. So I mentioned the lack of communication, which is a real problem. But it goes beyond that. It's the follow-up. It's the fact that there's not one case manager, so to speak, that's coordinating a lot of care for individuals who have mental health needs. It's not uncommon for those who have an inpatient hospitalization to fall off the map of care and support 7 days after discharge, which is a real problem. And then finally, accountability. And I know people don't like to talk about accountability, but particularly when we're talking about funding, I think this is important. Mental health providers rarely measure outcomes. And I'm a big data-driven person and working in education. How can we really say that what we're doing is effective or is having an impact if we don't have data to support that? And that's really important as well. So I mentioned a couple of the bills out there, and I'm not, certainly, focusing on anyone in the room. Please understand that. I think there's good stuff being done on both sides of the aisle with respect to this issue. And so it's not a political issue in my view. It's a good practice, good support of kids and families issue. And from the economic standpoint, and I tell my boards that I represent in education this all the time, we're either going to pay on the front end or we're going to pay on the back end with this. And again, having family members who have been incarcerated and seeing the waste with respect to resources in my family, I can speak to that, kind of speak truth to power there. It's an issue and something we need to be thinking about. So a couple bills that are focused, if we look at the human services workforce crisis, and that's what it is. Senate Bill 94, House Bill 2384, providing support for mental health staff member loan forgiveness programs. I know there's a lot of discussion right now about student debt and that issue on our economy and what we should be doing there. And I'm not here to talk about that issue at all. I think we need to support people that are going into this field, particularly in areas where there's not a lot of access. So an interesting piece of legislation to kind of pay attention to. House Bill 1690 establishes emerging health service psychologist program and provides for authorization of internship positions. And I mentioned training, really important if we know what works. And as an attorney, I see this, mentoring younger attorneys. Law schools, the last year in particular, is kind of a waste of time with respect to class. I think we'd be better served putting people in firms and allowing them to work with mentors to see what the practice is really like. And I think it's true for this area as well. So funding to support the mental health system, and that was referenced in Kim and her remarks earlier. So a few bills just highlight here. House Bill 2468 provides for school safety and security grant programs and student mental health focused grants. And this is the area I can probably speak to in a little more depth because, again, I represent school districts. We have a real problem right now, a perception problem with respect to communities and board members thinking that mental health is an issue that we don't want to wade into. So for instance, the PACE survey that provides data to schools about mental health needs and issues within the school system that schools can support, there's been a huge pullback over the course of really since COVID started, where we used to get 300 or so respondents on those surveys at a grade level. Now we're down sometimes to 20, 30. And that data, again, I'm a data guy. That's really important. How do we know how to help kids if we don't get that information? So why is that happening? Part of it is just this misconception that these are issues that are better dealt with in the home and not in school. But think about the story I told you earlier, and that's why I do that. Do you think my parents were addressing mental health? No one talked with me about the problems that we had in our household or provided access to any of those resources. So absent some amazing work by, quite frankly, angels, intuitive teachers that said, hey, you have some ability here, we're gonna support you, I couldn't be here today. I would have ended up repeating that cycle, that vicious cycle of intergenerational trauma and mental health related issues, substance abuse, any of those things. So it's important, again. House Bill 409, amending Human Services Code and Mental Health Departmental Powers and Duties, appointing a Commissioner of Mental Health, having an interstate compact with reciprocal agreements. We do this in special education. We have the IDEA, which has always been underfunded, which puts a lot of strain on our schools. But there is communication among states. You don't come into a state with an individual education program in one state and then not be able to navigate the system in a new state. We have federal requirements with respect to how we deal with that. I'm not suggesting it should be the same model or that model is perfect. I mean, the IDEA has not, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. In special ed, we talk in acronyms, so I apologize for that. That's what we do. But that law has not been reauthorized since 2008. Think about that. We didn't understand anything about trauma in 2008 and its impact on kids. There is not even any of the 14 eligibility categories in IDEA. There's nothing with respect to trauma. We have to fit you into one of those buckets we have. And that's a problem as well. And the regulations haven't been updated. So there are many, many things with that law that are problematic. So I'm not suggesting that's the perfect model. But if you look again at this bill, providing for mental health care services, a clearinghouse, and just making some change to the law. The clearinghouse piece, in many aspects of mental health, we have some really good national organizations that put together resources, but there's no coordination, and we need to make sure that our educators have access to that information. How am I doing?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, awesome. Thanks, Megan. I could not function in life without the Megans of the world. Funding to support the mental health system. Just a couple more bills. Again, you can look these all up on your own and take a look at whether this makes sense to you. Providing for mental health education, House Bill 784, House Bill 250, providing for mental health, physical disabilities, and developmental disabilities education. You see a theme here, right? We don't do a good job of teaching kids about mental health early on in their education so that we can eliminate the stigma, but also make sure, again, that they understand what is going on with them internally and that there are resources to help them. One of the big things, if you're a trauma kid, is suicidal ideation. And I've struggled with that in my own life. You feel very worthless as someone who grows up in that sort of environment. And if you don't have people to lean on, you don't have those resources, a lot of our kids end up dead because they don't know how to function in school. They don't have those bonds with peers because you're ashamed, isolation becomes a big deal and a way of coping. Some other legislation here, House Bill 2024, providing for mental health instruction and a study by the State Board of Education. I think that would be helpful. House Bill 844, providing mental health days as excused from school. This is something that we've seen around the country a little bit. It's gotten some traction some places. I do think post-COVID we have a bit of a truancy attendance issue in schools. The transition back to school has been very difficult for kids. All those kids, all of us have experienced trauma related to the pandemic. And I think we need to be cognizant of that when we're looking at things like discipline and school attendance. And I try to counsel my clients about that and making sure we're not so draconian in the way we approach school policy and rules, because that's not always the best thing for kids. And I'm not saying that we need to lower our expectations. In fact, the research around trauma, resilience, suggests that you need to increase expectations, because that allows kids to feel good about themselves and know that they have agency over what happens to them in their lives. But I do think we need, as the adults, to think a little bit about what this has been like. None of us experienced that going through school. So it was a very different experience that we shared as adults. And so I don't think any of us can really understand what it's like to be a young person now, particularly with the prevalence of use of social media, some of the mental health implications of that, and then you couple that with a pandemic where kids were out of school. And if you think about a traumatized kid, like I was when I was young, school might be the only safe place that these kids have to go. And imagine being in an abusive household with mental health issues amongst the adults or substance abuse issues all day long, and that's where you get your education. And maybe school was the only place you could get a meal. All of that has an impact on your mental health. So this whole idea of excusing kids from school for mental health days, I mean, we're seeing this in the workplace a little bit as well. I think we need to have grace with each other and grace with kids, that sometimes it's important to just hit the reset button on some of these issues. And there needs to be some structure around that. I'm all about having kids in school, for sure, but I think we need to be reasonable in our expectations. So, excuse me for a second here. I want to make sure I hit all of my key talking points that we talked about as a group. I did not talk about incarceration, but it was a big impact on my life, but trans-institutionalization. During the past 3 decades, jails and prisons have become de facto mental health hospitals. That's a problem. They're not equipped to be able to treat individuals, and if we look at incarceration and homelessness, there's where a lot of our mental health related issues lie, and we need to get our arms around that a little better as well. Issues in schools with respect to funding, I talked about a little bit, but mentioned the IDEA. It's a real frustration of mine that we support special education programming, but we haven't been able to figure out how those funds flow and how we're going to make sure that we meet the needs of students who have special education needs. And mental health is a big component of that, whether it be emotional disturbance, other health impairment. We are supposed to be supporting those students, and that system is broken. It's been broken both at the federal and at the state level. So something I think we really need to think about. We're asking a lot of our educators right now, and there's a reason that they are exiting the system en masse. They are, Kim mentioned it, that people are just tired. They are overburdened with a lot of this. My experience in working in education for 25 or so years now has been, you have your occasional person who's in it for the wrong reason, and we usually ferret those people out. But these are good people that go into that profession because they care about kids. And we are losing a lot of good and talented people right now because we're not supporting them effectively. So that's something I would like to see addressed, both personally as a father of 3 teenage kids who are in public school. And you will not find a bigger proponent of public education than I am, because public education saved me. I didn't have the ability to go to a private school that would cater to my individual needs. I had really good public school teachers. That's why I became a public school teacher for a bit in my career. So the underfunding piece, definitely there. Resistance from school boards, again, I mentioned this, to integrate mental health supports due to misinformation. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the press right now around, and a misunderstanding about what mental health providers are trying to accomplish and the supports they can lend to that really troublesome stuff going on in schools where the educators are overburdened. So we need to help coordinate that a little bit better. So just to kind of wrap up here a little bit, like I said, I just came back from Louisville, and I had the opportunity to, as I often do, this is a big special education institute, it's a few thousand people, and a lot of attorneys from around the country, and I've developed some strong friendships with those people. And it's great because you get to hear about what's going on around the country. But you also get to meet some really interesting people that are speakers. So I had an opportunity to hang out a little bit with Byron Pitts. I don't know anybody familiar with him. He's a co-anchor on Nightline and ABC. So Byron has a really interesting story, a lot of similarities between the way I grew up. And he is somebody that was sort of cast aside in school for mental health related issues and some of his academic barriers that he faced. But he's gone on to become a really great journalist. He's covered the last few presidents, wars in Iraq, and he's been all over the world and interviewing people and talking about a lot of issues. But he's written a couple books, and two of the things I took away from his comments that I think are meaningful here this morning is he talked about the Miracle Dunkirk. Anybody familiar with that? And the removal of troops in World War II by private citizens who had votes, and how the initial expectation was they would get maybe 10,000 of those troops out, and it ended up being a significantly higher number than that, and really was a huge aspect of being successful in the war effort. But he made an analogy saying, bring your boat, and that really resonated with me when we want to work with kids who are experiencing some of these problems. We sometimes underestimate what teachers. And like I said, I'm a big reader. I've always been a big reader. My sister is a very different path. She's a voracious reader as well. I think it's just wired into us. So I really connected with my English teachers. And I think one of the most important things that happened to me in my life is I took AP English my senior year, and I moved up from someone who was, being considered for an IEP, special education. It was a very different process then, but ended up in AP English by the time I graduated. And my Joe Giannotti just passed away, God bless him, great teacher. He failed me on a term paper right before I graduated, and he wrote me a super long note that I still have about my ability and how I needed to kind of step out of what I'd experienced growing up, and this was an important lesson that I could have agency over my life. And that helped me all the way through college. And because there's a lot of imposter syndrome sometimes with people. There was a time in my life where I could not stand in front of this room and talk about these things. I now talk to 2,000, 2,500 people about my experiences and why it's important to pay attention to these issues. So I think those are the two primary areas. And I might be a little bit myopic about the education area because it's where I work and what I know. My wife's a career teacher, so you can imagine some of the interesting conversations we have, me as a school solicitor and her as a teacher, particularly in collective bargaining issues. That's but yeah, educators really coach, and I view coaches as educators. So thanks for the question.
So all of us here, or I would say most of our crowd, are people that work in or are very knowledgeable about mental health. So when we are in the community and we're doing that kind of work, however it is that we do it in all the different ways that we have here today, we're familiar with what it means to have a mental health issue. But I think what I've been bumping into a lot lately is people saying, I don't need to access mental health services because I don't have a mental health issue. Because we're not understanding at a more basic level broadly in our communities what mental health is and what the needs are and what you can receive help for. And so I think they're seeing it as like these deeper, bigger, like very debilitating depression type of issues. So how can we, as people who have that knowledge, how would you suggest that we speak to people who maybe aren't as educated as we are, that are in our community, that are key stakeholders, that have more access, like the people that helped you, to have them understand that so they can mentor or do the things like you're suggesting? Because we have, as social workers, those of us in the room, a responsibility to give back to our community as part of our social work ethics. And it's not always us doing pro bono work. Sometimes it's explaining those things. So how would you say that we could do that?
I can tell you what I try to do. Okay. I work with as many community benefit organizations who are passionate about this issue as I can. And I try to get involved and I advocate. I'm an attorney, so obviously I have to practice law sometimes. My partner's being upset with me. But I do a lot of public speaking. I do a lot of just getting out and talking to folks about why this issue is important. So, sorry, there's a bug in here. So I think that's really important. You know, I think, you know, local school boards, talk to your local school boards about, for instance, the PAYS issue right now. Educate people. You have a lot of knowledge that people will benefit from, and what you see day to day, where you see the issues. I think talking about it, you know, the stigma piece I mentioned earlier as well, is I just normalizing this a little bit. You know, I do a lot of work in 504 in the ADA, and it's interesting. I mean, the courts have kind of gotten to the point in Congress through legislation that, you know, everyone in this room, and I'm not insulting anyone, has a disability under the ADA. That hurdle is not high. And people are okay, and we say that's okay in that context. When we start to talk about mental health and mental health treatment in particular, suddenly it's, whoa, I don't need that. And listen, I'm not suggesting I am, you know, the bravest person in the world, but I will say there's a certain amount of bravery to get up in front of a crowd, particularly a very esteemed crowd like this, as a professional, as, you know, a named partner in a law firm, and say, hey, I've struggled with these issues. I continue on this journey, and I want to help other people through what I've experienced. So my answer to your question is I don't have a great answer for you other than get out and talk about what you see, what you do, and advocate where you can.
Oh, can we hold them just, oh, I'm sorry, Mike. I told you. Oh, we'll take one more. We'll take, yeah. You earned it.
You talked about having PTSD all your life, and when I talk to fellow legislators, it's usually pretty easy when I talk about veterans that have PTSD. They get that. And then you say, but now think about a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old and their PTSD, and they go, well, they just make bad decisions. They just, you know, how have you been able to explain to people that a 6-year-old with PTSD is going through the same thing that a veteran did, from a different perspective, but still having the same issues with the cortisol and where the brain function is and things like that?
No, it's a great question. So I'm going to do a demonstration, so I don't know if I need the mic. I'll give you an example, and I use this a lot when I talk to educators. So I mentioned earlier that I was a fight response kid. So I didn't always know what the triggers were for that. So for instance, as the 6-year-old or 8-year-old in a classroom, say the very, you know, and I was this guy, you know, the enthusiastic classroom teacher, young 20-something male comes in, and you're all talking, and I want to get your attention. And I say, all right, quiet down. I'm triggered. I go into the cafeteria, 2 periods later, I'm in a fist fight. I have no idea why. And it's because exactly what you're saying. That part of my brain is taken over, that prefrontal cortex isn't functioning, and now I am in fight mode. So, and there's been great work, and thank God there has, around veterans. And, you know, my brother-in-law's in the Special Forces, and we talk about this stuff a lot. And, you know, he sometimes will share things he's seen, and other times he won't. But we didn't have a diagnosis of PTSD until the 70s. And, you know, I won't even get into the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and the APA and the money they make from that, and the fact that, you know, really, we focus so much on the diagnoses and not on the treatment. So, you know, if you check 5 boxes in a particular category, I mean, I've been told I have all sorts of different things. I mean, we've settled on PTSD because I had some very intuitive, again, treatment providers who said, no, you went through some horrible things in your life. It's like combat sometimes. I mean, when you're every day coming home to the father who, you know, you don't know what you're going to get. I mean, kids who have been traumatized in particular, we're better off knowing we're going to get abused every day than not knowing what's going to happen. That's more triggering and troublesome. But, you know, when your dad kicks in your door in the morning because he doesn't want to go to work, you know, takes it out on you, you can imagine what that's like when you get to school, and that classroom teacher doesn't know all that. So, you know, there are a lot of great bills that are floating around. I mean, one of the things I'll mention is the Handle with Care and for police, where there can be some communication between those kids who've had touch points with social services or the police over the weekend so that educators know when they get there. Because what I have found in my career representing school districts is that triggering event over the weekend, kid comes in, kid has an interaction with the teacher, next thing you know, we're down the expulsion path, we're down the suspension or expulsion path. And we know too that expulsion, suspensions, that's going to feed into the school or prison pipeline. So it's just a vicious cycle. So all right, I've taken far too much time. So I apologize. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So we're going to interrupt the agenda here. We just were alerted that the legislators need to leave at 9:30. So I'm sure most of you are eager to speak to the legislators. So we're going to do the Q&A right now. And then we'll have our other two speakers jump in after the Q&A. Does that seem like a good plan? Okay. Okay. So we're opening up the floor now for questions to the legislators, and we have, I believe, 11 represented this morning. So.
We talked a lot about schools and